Wasteland fans really are the best fans, so nobody accosted me over that, and they all have a nice understanding, and they're all here for a little bit of love. So, guys, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
I'd like to start. I got a little bit of, let's fill in a little bit. These guys were all, basically, you guys all started Latent Image, a little film company, made commercials, industrial films, things like that. Of course, and then, you know, that went from one day, we all know the story, pretty much over a beer and a sandwich one afternoon. It was actually Richard and Jack and George, was it not?
Well, actually, it was Russ. Russ and George started the whole thing, and then Gary and I joined about the same time. He was still in high school, and I had gotten out of the Army. And,
when it came to Latent Image and everything?
Yeah, Latent Image. At that point, George and Russ had moved from south side of Pittsburgh in a storefront flat, and they had gotten a loan from Regional Development Corporation, and they were able to move into better headquarters. And not long after that, Gary and I joined. We had all been friends from age 18.
Yeah, so together you had a little film company, or it's like, it sounds like you guys spent a lot of a teen and 20 years like me, misspent youth, and went, you know, hey, we'll do this.
I misspent 2 years of it in the Army. That was totally misspent.
Yeah, I'm glad it never called me up. So.
Did you hear that, kids? That's advice.
It was, Richard actually helped us find, George and me, helped us find our very first storefront business on the south side of Pittsburgh on Carson Street. If anybody knows Pittsburgh, it has become quite the hot spot.
What was it like then, though?
Not so much of a hot spot. We like to think that we helped create the hot spot, but that was a few years ago.
People thought it was a religion. George made this ice out of a commode bowl in the winter to use it. I could tell you some stories about that, but I don't want to hog the whole show. But people would call up and they'd say, "What is Latent Image? A religion? Is it affiliated with the Salvation Army?" Or it would have been a good idea if it was, because they could have accepted donations.
Yeah. Please drop off some old clothes.
Or is it a beauty shop? No.
So,
people didn't know.
One day, even at the new location, somebody called up and wanted to know when their carpets were going to be delivered. They asked for Mrs. Latent. So we joked that they must have thought it was Image Latent.
I have to tell this one anecdote. It has to do with my mother, our beloved Josephine Striner. When we first started Latent Image, she was kind of skeptical about, you know, what is Russell into and what is he getting his brother Gary into. And she had a friend by the name of Ann Devlin. George and I were sleeping at our storefront Latent Image. We lived there for the better part of a year. My mother and Ann Devlin came to meet us one night. And there was a fellow in the neighborhood that we lovingly called the musician. I don't think Gary maybe doesn't even know this story. The musician would work his way from bar to bar on the south side, which there were many bars, and he would sing, okay, and not badly, but he would sing, and people would buy him beers, and that's how he kept himself going. At any rate, he would come and occasionally visit George and me at the Latent Image. Well, one day, George wasn't there. I was there by myself, and my mother and Ann Devlin show up in the evening, early evening, to visit us. And the musician shows up, and it was a little bit cold. He had, warm clothing on, and he had a red and black checked kind of hunting cap that had earlugs on it. Now understand, my mother didn't come to visit us too often. So she comes in, the musician comes in, who the musician also happened to live upstairs of the Latent Image in an apartment. and they're chatting, and he says he's a singer and so forth. And at one point, he takes his hat off. He was talking about how difficult it was for soldiers in the Second World War. They had to eat out of their helmets sometimes. He takes his hat off, and he had this hunting cap full of spaghetti. This is not a made-up story. This is absolutely true. Well, my mother and Ann Devlin, here's the guy coming upstairs, the musician, and he's got spaghetti plastered on his head. My mother was convinced that I was completely on the wrong path. And she may have been right.
I never heard that one. I thought I heard everything.
That's absolute true story.
If I put my mic there, we get feedback.
Should be.
Well, here's a related story. Do you mind? When I was going into the Army, I got Rudy Ritchie, who was a friend of all of us. Rudy says, let's go down and see Russ and George at Leighton Image and say, you can say goodbye because you're going to the Army. So Rudy had a 55 Plymouth convertible, which was old even then. And he popped some popcorn in it was one of those popcorn things where it had aluminum foil and you Jiffy Pop. And it popped, and the aluminum thing turned out to be a big ball with popcorn in it. And he grabbed a 6-pack of Pepsi, and I said, why are you doing that? And he said, well, George and Russ haven't eaten for 3 or 4 days. So we get down to the place, and they had, at this point, a pet owl with a broken wing, and a pet monkey, and they used to, when there was no work, which was 90% of the time, George and Russ would sit in the window of the place playing hockey. And it was the kind of hockey where you moved the men around with levers or something. I hated all those games. They liked them. So they fed the popcorn to the monkey and they drank the Pepsi. And they said, if we're doing well when you get out of the Army, you can come and work with us. Well, I mean, by this time, that's what I wanted to do, right? And, you know, make movies. We were all bitten by the movie bug, thanks largely to George. And that dream of working with him kept me going for a couple of years in the Army through all the bullshit that you have to go through. And I didn't go into combat. Almost did, but I didn't. And so when I got out, they were doing better, and they hired me right off my teaching job. And then Gary came out. I didn't even know Gary till now. He's not going to say anything. That's why he was.
Oh, I'm waiting, buddy. I'm waiting. I got a humdinger coming.
Russ, I understand you were pretty good at foosball too. Got to win a few bets here and there on that machine.
That was chess.
Oh, chess.
That was
chess, poker, anything to win some, huh?
So whatever to stay alive.
So how did we go from the early works of Leighton Image to Night of the Living Dead?
Well, hold on, we'll get to that in a minute. Gary had
Back to foosball, okay.
Yeah, no, we're not back to
Two
foosball.
moderators, and ladies that are on opposite ends.
Question withdrawn.
Well, my story is quite interesting because I was in high school at the time, and brother Russ was in the movie business, you know, and you know, by all accounts, I should have gone off and had a career working in the mill. That's what you did in Pittsburgh, you know. And so all of a sudden, I was actually introduced way earlier when Russ and George were shooting a film called Expostulations, and I was out for the day as an extra. I remember nothing about the film other than we were in a park somewhere. What they were shooting, I really had no idea. So that was my first entree into the movie making business, and so by and by, this is when they had been in the South Side for a little while. I don't know how long, not terribly long. And I was summer. I was in high school. I was a junior in high school, and it's like, okay, I'm going to go down and see what I can do. And so it was basically a 3-room storefront. There was a storefront, and there was a room behind it, and then there was the back room. Well, and it was all a disaster. I mean, George had been living there for I don't know how many years, and George had this. I don't know. He was in a good position, I guess, where his parents would send him clothes so that he didn't have to do laundry. And there must have been 200 shirts, white shirts, stuffed under this like cubby hole under the steps that went up to the second floor. So they said, well, we need to get this place cleaned out. And one of the areas that we can't use is this back room because George was also a Pepsi addict and he was a chain smoker. He couldn't speak in the morning before he had a cigarette in his mouth. And he used the pop bottles to put his cigarette butts out in. And it was my job, should I choose to take it, to clean out all of these bottles. And my pay was to take them across the street to the little store and get the 2 cents on each bottle. I spent weeks, and I had to drain because they wouldn't take them with all that crap in it. So I had to clean all that out. And I guess that's like.
Yeah, guess who inherited that job? even in the new place, the first thing that I did was cleaned up the whole studio space. There must have been 50 pairs of shoes that were brand new. And I'm looking at these shoes and I'm thinking, who in the hell why are these shoes here? Because you could turn them over and look at the soles and heels.
And they were barely worn.
They weren't worn. They might have had a little dust. And so it was George. Every time as broke as we were, when he needed a new suit of clothes, like to meet a client, he didn't need a new suit of clothes, but he would go to this tall men's store on Liberty Avenue in Pittsburgh, and he'd buy a complete outfit from head to toe. And the old one just got thrown somewhere.